In the heart of a 17th century convent, surrounded by secrets and prayers, a young nun experienced a phenomenon that continues to intrigue and haunt scholars to this day, especially because her name remains a secret kept by the Church. During moments of deep trance, she wrote enigmatic messages in unknown languages, with words that foretold tragedies and events that would shape the course of history. Her manuscripts, as disturbing as they were fascinating, were quickly deemed dangerous by the Church and hidden away in vaults that remain sealed to this day. But what exactly did the nun write that inspired such fear? Were these messages mere delusions or revelations of supernatural forces that she somehow accessed? And if true, what might these lost prophecies still reveal about the fate of humanity? In the monastic silence of a 17th century convent, the nuns devoted their lives to prayer and hard work. The place was a haven of faith, where days were marked by the sound of bells and the murmuring of constant prayers. However, for one young nun, known only by a baptismal name never recorded in the annals of history, this routine began to transform into a living nightmare. It all started with disturbing dreams that grew more intense night after night. She saw figures cloaked in shadows, heard whispers in languages she had never learned, and felt a presence that seemed to invade her room even when the doors were locked. At first, she kept these occurrences to herself, fearing accusations of hysteria or spiritual weakness. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning of something far greater. At a certain point, the dreams gave way to waking visions. During moments of prayer, she began to see symbols glowing on the walls and threatening figures that no one else could see. The nuns around her noticed her change. The young woman appeared pale, distracted, as if carrying an invisible burden. Gradually, the other sisters started to avoid her, fearing that something of a malignant origin was manifesting within her. One morning, during a communal breakfast, the young nun fell into a trance for the first time in front of everyone. Her eyes rolled back, and she began murmuring words no one could understand. Some nuns screamed, others fell to their knees praying, and one ran to fetch the priest in charge of the convent. When the trance ended, she awoke confused and terrified, with no memory of what had happened. Shortly after, the first writings appeared. The young nun was found in her room, surrounded by pages filled with intricate symbols and words that seemed to belong to various ancient languages. Curiously, she had not received enough formal education to write fluently in her own language. How, then, could she have produced something so complex? The convent leaders initially believed it might be a divine work. Was the young woman receiving messages from heaven, or was it the opposite? The messages, when analyzed by a more learned priest, began to reveal a deeply unsettling nature. They spoke of events that, at the time, seemed improbable but would later come to pass. Over the weeks, the young nun began to write in trances that became increasingly frequent. She seemed unable to control her own hand, which moved with frightening speed, producing entire pages in mere minutes. When questioned about the content of the messages, she would cry and plead for help, saying the voices in her head would not leave her in peace. The convent, once a place of serenity, was overtaken by an atmosphere of fear. The nuns began to hear strange noises at night. Doors opened and closed on their own, and even the animals living there appeared restless. It was as if the very physical space of the convent had been invaded by an invisible force, something beyond human understanding. The church leadership was summoned, bringing with it priests experienced in dealing with supernatural phenomena. This was the beginning of the first exorcisms, which quickly turned into spectacles of terror. The young nuns screamed in dead languages, described scenes of destruction, and accused the priests of sins only they could know. What exactly was speaking through her? The writings continued to appear, even when the young woman was locked under constant watch. Pages would mysteriously emerge in unlikely places, such as under her pillow or inside locked drawers. To the religious figures present, this was proof that supernatural forces were at work. But were these forces demonic, or something more complex? Something that challenged the Church's notions of good and evil? The mystery grew so significant that senior clergy decided to intervene. The most disturbing texts were quickly confiscated and sent to scholars selected by the Church. Even the most erudite among them struggled to interpret the writings. Why? Could they be coded messages intended only for minds prepared to understand them? And the most frightening part, portions of what was translated began to make sense. Some words seemed to describe, with precision, future catastrophes, devastating fires, wars of global proportions, and even the deaths of prominent clergy figures. It was as if these manuscripts were a record of what was to come, something humanity perhaps was not meant to know. In the end, the young nun, increasingly debilitated, was isolated in a locked room. The nuns who tried to visit her were forbidden from speaking of what they saw or heard. The young woman appeared to be wasting away, yet her writing continued. What fueled her strength to write, even in such a weakened state? And what if these messages were not merely the result of possession but something greater? Perhaps a warning, a call to attention for humanity. How can one distinguish between a divine revelation and a malignant manifestation? These questions echo unanswered to this day, feeding the mystery surrounding the convent and its prophetic nun. When the first reports about the young nun reached the upper echelons of the church, the reactions were immediate. For the Vatican, a case like this was potentially dangerous, not just because of the possible involvement of malevolent forces, but also due to the consequences the text could have for faith and the stability of the institution. After all, how does one handle a supposed prophecy that appears to contradict or, worse, threaten the doctrinal foundations of the church? Priests and theologians were sent to the convent to assess the situation. They brought with them instruments for exorcisms and specific prayer books to confront demonic manifestations. Yet, upon confronting the nun, many of them left terrified. During some sessions, she spoke in languages extinct for centuries, such as Etruscan and Sumerian. How could a young woman with no access to any form of higher education possess such knowledge? The priests also began to notice a disturbing pattern in the texts. There were veiled criticisms of the church's structure, references to corruption among its leaders, and warnings of radical changes that would reshape society. Were these words the product of something evil, aiming to sow discord? Or could they be a warning about what needed reforming to save the institution? Additionally, certain events described in the writings began to manifest within the convent. Some texts predicted minor tragedies, a fire in the kitchen, the sudden death of one of the nuns, that occurred exactly as described. This level of precision unnerved even the most skeptical, who started to see the nun not just as a possessed woman, but as a messenger for something far beyond human understanding. The church's response was drastic. The young nun was declared dangerous to the faith, and the convent was transformed into a sort of spiritual prison. She was completely cut off from the outside world, and the writings she produced were systematically confiscated. Yet, despite all this vigilance, the texts continued to appear. Why, then, was she not simply eliminated? What stopped the church from ending this definitively? The answer may lie in the content of the texts. According to accounts, some priests who had access to the messages believed they were not entirely malevolent. Though they carried apocalyptic tones, there were passages that spoke of redemption, spiritual rebirth, and even a balance between light and darkness. This ambiguity created divisions among the clergy. Was she a prophet of God or a puppet of dark forces? Meanwhile, the exorcism rituals persisted, but with no success. Each attempt seemed to weaken the young nun physically, yet the writings became more complex and urgent. During one of these rituals, an older priest is said to have asked the entity manifesting through her directly, "Who are you?" The response, recorded in a document from the time, was simply, "The voice that sees what the blind ignore." This simple but enigmatic phrase intrigued the church's scholars. What was being ignored? Was it a doctrinal error, a forbidden truth, or a revelation about humanity's destiny? These questions tormented the priests, many of whom chose to abandon the case, claiming it was beyond their comprehension and faith. The situation became so critical that the Vatican decided to send the most alarming manuscripts to its secret archives. These vaults, known for housing documents that could shake the world's faith, became the final repository of the nun's words. Little is known about what was actually stored, but some modern scholars who have accessed fragments claim that the messages referenced events yet to occur. There was, however, an even more unsettling detail. Some priests reported that after reading the manuscripts, they began experiencing nightmares similar to those of the nun, visions of destruction and indescribable creatures. Were these visions a form of spiritual contamination? Or did the texts possess a power that transcended rational thought? Another point troubling the church leadership was the potential impact these messages could have if made public. In an era where the clergy held near absolute control over spiritual narratives, a text that criticized or exposed weaknesses within the institution would have been catastrophic. Could this have been the real reason for hiding the writings? The mystery also drew linguists and independent scholars over the centuries. Some analyzed fragments and discovered a sort of code, as if the most important messages were hidden among the words. Why encode something unless to protect it or restrict access to it? Could it be that these codes remain undeciphered because they were never meant for human understanding? In the end, one question remains: what exactly was being written? If the messages were the work of an evil spirit, why did they contain visions of hope and redemption? If they were divine, why did they inspire such fear and confusion? Could this point to a third force, something beyond the binary notions of good and evil to which we are accustomed? The Church, for its part, has never fully clarified its position. The silence surrounding the case is absolute, and those who attempt to investigate are met with walls of secrecy. But the more the Church conceals, the greater the curiosity grows. What could these messages have meant to be considered so dangerous? After years of living in near total isolation, the nun's health began to deteriorate. Her frail body could no longer withstand the rigors of exorcism sessions and confinement in a cold, damp cell. Despite this, her hands seemed never to rest. Even in evident weakness, page after page of texts continued to appear, as if an invisible force compelled her to write. At that time, only a few were allowed to visit her. The nuns in the convent were given strict orders not to speak of what they saw or heard, and the priests overseeing the case hesitated to share details, even with their superiors. This atmosphere of absolute secrecy only fueled further speculation. Did the Vatican know more than it was willing to admit? The nun passed away on a cold, early morning. Her body was found curled up, her hands still clutching a quill and a half-written sheet of paper. On that sheet, it is said, was her final sentence, but its contents were never revealed. The Church immediately confiscated the manuscript, along with everything else she had produced in preceding years. What makes her death even more intriguing are the reports that emerged afterward. Nuns claimed to hear chants in unknown languages coming from her cell, even after her passing. One priest reported feeling an icy presence as he collected her final writings. Could it be possible that something remained there, tied to the space she had inhabited for so long? Following her death, the convent was partially decommissioned, and its history shrouded in mystery. No official records detail the events that took place there, except for fragments preserved in personal diaries of some nuns and oral accounts passed down over the years. Why was such an extraordinary case almost entirely erased from the official history of the Church? The manuscripts were sent directly to the Vatican, where they joined other documents deemed too dangerous for public release. Many believe they are now housed in the infamous secret archives, protected by layers of physical and spiritual security. Only a select elite would have access to these texts. The decision to conceal these documents raised many questions, not just among theologians, but also linguists, historians, and even scientists. After all, if the texts were merely the ravings of a disturbed mind, why such secrecy? Wouldn't it have been easier to discredit their origin and dismiss them as irrelevant? Scholars who managed to access fragments of these writings have revealed details that make the case even more fascinating. The texts, apparently, contained references to events that would occur centuries later. Among the most striking predictions were vague yet unmistakable descriptions of global wars, pandemics, and even climate change. Additionally, there were messages that seemed directed specifically at the Church. One, with an uncertain translation, read something like, "The shepherd will lose his flock when the wolf wears the lamb's mantle." This enigmatic phrase sparked debates about whether it could be a critique of religious authorities or a warning about the institution's future. Another curious aspect of the manuscripts is the use of symbols that have yet to be fully deciphered. Complex diagrams of interconnected circles, combinations of numbers, and geometric shapes suggest that the messages might contain layers of hidden meaning. Could these symbols hold knowledge humanity is not yet prepared to understand? The mystery surrounding the identity of the entity that possessed the nun also persists. Some scholars believe it was not a demon in the traditional sense, but something that transcended religious categories. A force capable of both enlightenment and destruction, depending on how it was perceived. The narrative becomes even more complicated with reports that some individuals who studied the manuscripts experienced strange consequences. Recurrent nightmares, memory loss, and even unexplained deaths were linked to prolonged exposure to the texts. Could the content carry a spiritual weight so intense that it affected those who dared to explore it? One of the greatest mysteries is why the Church continues to keep these texts hidden. Many believe the Vatican fears the implications they could have for faith and world order. Others, however, argue that there is something in the writings that challenges humanity's very perception of reality. As we ponder the fate of these manuscripts, an unsettling question arises. What if the knowledge they contain is indeed dangerous? Could there be truths that humanity is not yet prepared to face? Or is the Church's silence an attempt to control the power these messages represent? Even centuries after the nun's death, the impact of her story endures. Whether as a spiritual warning, a supernatural manifestation, or an unresolved enigma, her writings continue to fascinate and challenge our understanding of the unknown. After the nun's death and the confiscation of her manuscripts, fragments of the material eventually escaped the Church's restrictions. Whether through negligence or the deliberate actions of discontented members, small excerpts of the texts reached the hands of linguists and independent scholars centuries later. The translations of these fragments revealed something beyond simple prophecies. The messages seemed to contain instructions and warnings about the use of forgotten, possibly forbidden, knowledge. The text spoke of a hidden order of forces governing the world, forces not confined to conventional notions of good and evil. They describe something akin to a universal energetic structure, an invisible web connecting all things, which, if improperly manipulated, could bring chaos. The terminology used in these passages puzzled linguists, as some words appeared to belong to no known earthly language, as if they were fragments of a cosmic or archetypal tongue. One of the most intriguing translated passages mentioned the veil between worlds that would thin during certain historical periods. This veil, according to the texts, maintained balance between parallel realities or spiritual dimensions. While such an idea seemed absurd by the scientific standards of the time, it resonates with modern theories about multiverses and quantum energy. Could the nun, under the influence of something supernatural, have been accessing knowledge humanity had yet to comprehend? Another fragment referred to climatic catastrophes that, astonishingly, described environmental changes with unsettling parallels to our own time. The language suggested that these tragedies were not random events but part of a larger cycle, governed by human negligence and forces beyond earthly control. Even more intriguing were the symbols found alongside the texts. These included geometric figures and diagrams that some scholars linked to alchemical or esoteric practices. Were these symbols keys to accessing hidden knowledge? Or were they merely unconscious expressions of a suffering mind? The recurring presence of similar patterns in ancient cultures hints that these diagrams may have far deeper roots, perhaps even prehistoric ones. Linguists also noticed an unusual detail. The words were arranged in rhythmic patterns, almost like chants or prayers. Some fragments were so methodically structured that it seemed there was an embedded code. Were they meant to be recited, perhaps to invoke or activate something? This possibility intrigued modern researchers, who speculate that the writings might be spiritual formulas or rituals of power. If this theory is correct, then who or what taught these patterns to the nun? Furthermore, some scholars questioned why the messages seemed to target a very specific audience. They did not carry the universal tone of a warning for all humanity, but rather appeared directed at a spiritual or intellectual elite capable of deciphering them. Was the nun writing for the Church itself, attempting to reveal truths she had received? Or was she transmitting messages from a force she barely understood? The mystery deepens when considering that many of the deciphered fragments appeared to have multiple layers of meaning. For instance, a phrase that at first seemed to describe an apocalyptic event could also be interpreted as a metaphor for spiritual transformation. This duality reinforces the idea that the texts operated on different levels of understanding, depending on the reader. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect was the persistent recurrence of a theme, the fall of the light. This phrase, translated in various ways, suggested the collapse of values or structures humanity held as immutable. It was unclear whether this light referred to the Church itself, collective faith, or something even greater, but the implication was unmistakable. The world was in peril, and time was running out. Over the centuries, the studied fragments have continued to raise questions that challenge both science and spirituality. How could someone so isolated access such advanced ideas? And, more importantly, why were these messages, seemingly so relevant, buried? Could the Church be attempting to protect humanity from something it is not yet ready to face? Few places in the world spark as much curiosity as the Vatican secret archives. Located in a subterranean complex protected by rigorous security measures, these archives house thousands of documents accumulated over centuries. Among them, persistent rumors suggest, are the manuscripts of the possessed nun, some of the most controversial texts ever produced by humanity. Officially, the archives are an institution of historical preservation. However, the term secret is not coincidental. Access is restricted to a limited number of individuals, and even they must obtain special permissions to consult only the specific documents they request. Free exploration of the shelves or independent investigation is strictly prohibited. Why such control? What exactly is being guarded there? Historically, the archives contain records of great significance. Letters from figures such as Michelangelo and Napoleon, papal bulls, secret treaties between kingdoms, and documentation from Galileo Galilei's trial. Yet, there is always a deeper layer of mystery, suggesting that the most sensitive documents have never been disclosed. These are believed to include texts that could shake the foundations of Christian faith, including supposed records of supernatural events. The case of the possessed nun is frequently associated with these archives due to the Church's absolute silence about the writings. The apocalyptic nature of the messages and the precision of the prophecies would make the texts dangerous, not only to the Vatican but also to societal stability. Some theories suggest that the manuscripts might be stored alongside other equally controversial documents, such as records of the Fatima apparitions or even texts questioning the authenticity of parts of the Bible. Scholars attempting to investigate the archives have faced nearly insurmountable resistance. Records show that linguists and historians have received controlled fragments, but access to the complete set of the nun's manuscripts has never been granted. Why this fragmentation? Could it be that the texts, read in their entirety, contain a secret so devastating that their implications would be impossible to handle? Some theorists suggest that the Church is not merely safeguarding the documents, but actively studying their meanings in secret. Rumors claim that a special order of scholars, composed of theologians and scientists, works within the archives to interpret these texts and assess their potential impact on the world. If true, what is their purpose? Are they trying to decipher the prophecies and control the future the texts predict? An unsettling aspect is the rumor that the documents themselves may possess supernatural properties. Some believe that the nun's texts, for example, carry a residual energy from the phenomenon that produced them, affecting those who come into contact with them. While such accounts are dismissed as superstition by most, they align with testimonies from those who have handled the fragments. The absolute secrecy surrounding the archives raises a disturbing question. What if the Church is not merely protecting these documents from prying eyes, but shielding humanity from knowledge it is not yet ready to understand? This possibility suggests that the texts contain something that transcends mere writing, perhaps a truth that would forever alter our perception of reality. But there is another side to this coin. What if the secrecy is not for humanity's protection but to preserve the Church's power? For centuries, the Church has been the guardian of spiritual knowledge. Revealing that something as impactful as the nun's prophecies was hidden away could raise questions about the institution's transparency and its relationship with the divine. Ultimately, the mystery of the Vatican's secret archives endures. Only a small fraction of their secrets is known, and the texts of the possessed nun are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Is the Church hiding something that could save the world or destroy it? The nun's writings were not mere meaningless scribbles. Her words, filled with symbolism and metaphors, carried clear messages about future events that have already begun to unfold. If some of her predictions have proven accurate, what can be said about the parts still not understood? What else lies ahead? Some of the already translated prophecies spoke of devastating wars and pandemics that would sweep across continents, leaving trails of death and chaos. These descriptions not only align with historical events, such as the Great Wars of the 20th century, but also point to a sequence of natural disasters that only recently began to make sense. The nun mentioned a fire from the heavens and waters swallowing lands, which some interpret as references to meteors or rising sea levels. What intrigues most is the mention of a fall of the light. Though the exact meaning is still debated, modern scholars speculate that the phrase could refer to the collapse of energy systems, such as global blackouts, or even to the weakening of humanity's core values and principles. Whatever the interpretation, the tone of the texts indicates that the world will face challenges testing not only its technology but also its collective morality. Another recurring prediction in the nun's writings is of an invisible war, a battle not fought with conventional weapons but in the spiritual and psychological realms. With the rise of technologies like artificial intelligence and information manipulation, this idea takes on a disturbing significance. Could the nun have somehow foreseen a future where human minds are manipulated on a massive scale? The most alarming aspect is that the texts seem to follow a progression. The prophecies that have already come to pass were only the initial stages of something larger, a cycle of destruction and rebirth still underway. What comes next? Some sections of the text speak of a rebirth from the ashes, suggesting that after chaos, there will be an opportunity for redemption and rebuilding. But will that opportunity be for all, or only a few? The texts also raise questions about free will. If the prophecies are inevitable, is humanity doomed to follow this destiny? Or could understanding the causes of these events alter their course? The nun seemed clear on one point. The responsibility for the future lies, in part, with humanity. But are we capable of bearing it? Finally, what if the prophecies are not merely warnings but instructions for surviving what is to come? Are we ignoring messages that could save billions of lives? In this case, wouldn't the Church's silence be a monumental mistake? The nun's words still echo, locked away in vaults and in the memories of the few who dared to study them. If her predictions come true, will humanity be ready to face what was foreseen? Or will we be blindsided by what we were warned about but chose to ignore? The story of the possessed nun, her mysterious manuscripts, and the prophecies that resonate to this day make us reflect on the limits between the supernatural and the rational. What she saw or accessed in her trances remains a mystery, but her words still provoke us. Were they warnings for humanity or enigmas meant never to be fully understood? The Church's silence and the secrecy surrounding these texts only fuel fascination, leaving us with the unsettling feeling that there is far more than we know. Whether as a historical curiosity, a spiritual warning, or a secret guarded out of fear of its impact, the nun's legacy remains alive. We may never uncover the full truth, but what we already know is enough to remind us that the unknown is always present, waiting to be unveiled. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected some videos for you filled with profound knowledge and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step to transforming your reality.